Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Enigma. Here we share real-life experiences of encounters with the unknown, stories that come from beyond the stars, crafted to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this mystery reaches. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away. Story 1. It wasn't the first time the hallway light flickered at odd intervals. Comings and goings were routine, a shuffle of footsteps that no one bothered to track. The mail piled neatly, except for the one envelope that always seemed to be missing. I didn't turn to see or ask who took it. It simply belonged somewhere else. The room felt a degree cooler than it should have been, and the curtains hung just a bit unevenly. I adjusted the blinds without thinking much of it. When I left, I made sure the blinds were uneven again. The first dream came on a Tuesday, or maybe it was Wednesday. I've never been good with specifics when it comes to sleep. I was lying in my bed, the familiar weight of the blanket across my chest, when I noticed the light. Not the bedside lamp, not the streetlight filtering through the window. This was different. An oval glow, soft and pulsing, hovering somewhere above me like a second moon that had wandered indoors. I remember thinking how strange it was that I could see it so clearly with my eyes closed. The light breathed, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that didn't match my heartbeat. It was warmer than the room, warmer than it should have been. I tried to open my eyes properly to see if it was real, but my eyelids felt heavy, weighted down by sleep. There was a sound too, distant at first, like someone adjusting a radio dial in another room, a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I wanted to get up to investigate, but my body felt anchored to the mattress. The dream faded as dreams do, dissolving into morning light and the ordinary sounds of traffic outside. I blamed it on stress. Work had been demanding lately, the kind of demanding that follows you home and sits in your peripheral vision while you try to relax. The mind processes things in strange ways when it's overloaded. Everyone knows that. Everyone has strange dreams when they're tired. But the dream came back. The second time I was more aware of the details. The oval light was closer now, close enough that I could feel its warmth on my face. It pulsed with more intensity, and I noticed that each pulse was accompanied by that same low hum. The sound was clearer now, more defined, not quite a voice but not quite mechanical either. Something in between, like words being spoken through water. I could feel myself trying to focus on what it was saying, straining to understand the muffled syllables that drifted down from somewhere above my bed. The harder I concentrated, the more the words seemed to slip away, like trying to hold on to water. My body felt different this time too, lighter somehow, as if the mattress beneath me had softened into something more yielding. The sensation was almost pleasant, like floating in a warm bath. But there was something else, something that made my skin prickle with unease. I felt watched, not just observed, but studied, examined with the kind of attention that makes you want to check if your clothes are on properly. I tried to move, to roll over or sit up, but my limbs wouldn't respond. They felt distant, disconnected, as if they belonged to someone else. When I finally woke up, really woke up, my sheets were damp with perspiration and my mouth tasted like metal. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, waiting for the dream to fade the way dreams are supposed to. But it didn't fade. It lingered, clinging to the edges of my consciousness like smoke in fabric. I started noticing things during the day. Small things, insignificant things that probably meant nothing. The coffee mug I'd left on the kitchen counter was on the other side of the sink when I came home from work. I must have moved it and forgotten. The kind of absent-minded action everyone does a dozen times a day without thinking. There was a small mark on my wrist, a tiny red dot like a pinprick. I couldn't remember how I'd gotten it. Maybe I'd scratched myself on something sharp, or maybe an insect had bitten me during the night. These things happen. Skin is delicate, easily marked by the smallest contact. The radio in my car had been tuned to a different station. Static filled the speakers when I turned it on, that same low hum I'd heard in the dream. I quickly changed it back to my usual station and told myself it was just a coincidence. Electronics malfunction all the time. Radio waves get crossed, signals interfere with each other. But the static followed me. I heard it in the spaces between songs, in the quiet moments when the air conditioner cycled off, in the pause between one breath and the next. It was always there, just beneath the surface of normal sounds, waiting to be noticed. The third dream was different, more vivid, more present. I wasn't just observing it, I was living inside it. The oval light had descended closer, so close I could see patterns within its glow, swirling currents of brightness that moved like slow liquid. The warmth on my face was more intense now, almost uncomfortable, like standing too close to a fire. The humming had resolved into something that might have been speech. I still couldn't make out individual words, but there was a cadence to it, a rhythm that suggested meaning. Someone was trying to communicate, trying to tell me something important. I strained to listen, to understand, but the meaning remained just out of reach. My body felt even lighter this time, as if I were gradually becoming weightless. I had the sensation of rising, of being gently lifted away from the bed, though I couldn't see myself moving. The room around me seemed to stretch and bend, walls curving away into impossible distances. The ceiling dissolved into darkness punctuated by that single, pulsing light. I tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but no sound came from my throat. My voice was gone, stolen, or simply irrelevant. I was there to listen, not to participate. The realization should have been frightening, but instead it felt strangely natural, as if this was how things were supposed to be. Time moved differently in this space. Minutes could have been hours, or hours could have been seconds. I existed in a bubble of warm light and muffled sound, suspended between sleeping and waking. Part of me wanted to struggle, to fight against whatever was happening, but a larger part simply accepted it. This was my dream after all. I was in control, even if it didn't feel that way. When I woke up, the taste of metal in my mouth was stronger. My pillow was damp, not with sweat this time, but with something else. Something clear and slightly viscous that dried quickly when exposed to air. I touched it with my finger and it felt slippery, almost oily. I told myself it was saliva, that I drooled in my sleep. People do that sometimes when they sleep deeply. But the substance had no taste, no smell. It was perfectly neutral, like distilled water, but with a different texture. I washed my face and changed the pillowcase, trying not to think about it too much. Dreams can affect the body in strange ways. Stress manifests in physical symptoms all the time. The days began to blur together after that. I found myself losing track of conversations, forgetting what I was doing in the middle of tasks. My coworkers asked if I was feeling all right, if I needed to take some time off. I smiled and assured them I was fine, just tired. Everyone understood tired. But I wasn't just tired, I was changing, becoming something different. The dreams were bleeding into my waking hours, carrying pieces of that other world into this one. I would catch glimpses of oval light in my peripheral vision, always disappearing when I turned to look directly. The humming followed me everywhere now, a constant background noise that no one else seemed to hear. I started finding things in my apartment that I didn't remember placing there. A glass of water on the nightstand that I hadn't poured, a book open to a page I hadn't been reading. My clothes arranged differently in the closet, organized according to some system I didn't recognize, but that felt oddly familiar. The mark on my wrist had faded, but others appeared, tiny red dots in a pattern that almost looked deliberate. They didn't hurt, didn't itch, or cause any discomfort. They were simply there like freckles or birthmarks I'd somehow never noticed before. I counted them sometimes, running my finger across each small mark. 7 on my left arm, 5 on my right, 3 on my shoulder. The numbers felt significant, though I couldn't say why. Sleep became something I both craved and feared. The dreams were more real now than my waking life, more vivid and immediate than anything that happened during the day. I looked forward to that moment of weightlessness, to the warm embrace of the oval light, but I also dreaded it, sensing that each dream took me further from something I was supposed to remember. The fourth dream lasted longer than the others, or maybe time had stopped meaning anything coherent. I floated in that space of warm light and muffled voices, no longer trying to understand what was being said to me. Understanding wasn't the point. The point was to be present, to be available, to let whatever was happening simply happen. I could feel hands on me, though I saw no one. Gentle touches that mapped the contours of my body with scientific precision. There was no intimacy in it, no human warmth, just careful, methodical contact that left no part of me unexamined. I should have been frightened, should have struggled against the invasion of my personal space, but fear seemed like a concept from another life, irrelevant to my current situation. The hands were neither warm nor cold. They existed at exactly the temperature of my own skin, making it difficult to tell where I ended and they began. Sometimes I wasn't sure if I was being touched or if I was touching something else. The boundaries between self and other had become negotiable, subject to revision without notice. When I finally returned to my bed, to my body, to the weight of blankets and the solidity of the mattress, I felt like a stranger in my own skin. Everything was too heavy, too dense, too limited. My apartment seemed impossibly small after the vast spaces of the dream. The walls pressed in around me, confining me to a reality that felt increasingly artificial. I got up and walked to the bathroom, needing to see my reflection to confirm that I was still myself. The person in the mirror looked familiar but somehow diminished, as if they were a copy of a copy, slightly degraded from the original. My eyes were the same color they'd always been, but they held a different quality of light, something that hadn't been there before, or something that had always been there but was only now becoming visible. The marks on my skin had multiplied overnight, not just the small red dots, but thin lines that traced patterns across my arms and chest. They looked like a map of somewhere I'd never been, or maybe somewhere I'd forgotten I'd visited. I traced them with my finger, following pathways that seemed to lead toward some destination I couldn't name. Work became impossible to focus on. I sat at my desk and stared at my computer screen, but the words wouldn't arrange themselves into meaning. My colleagues spoke to me and I nodded at appropriate intervals, but their voices sounded like they were coming from very far away. I was present but not present, participating in a performance of normalcy that felt increasingly hollow. During lunch breaks, I found myself drawn to quiet spaces. Empty conference rooms, stairwells, the roof of the building where no one else went. I would stand there and listen for the humming, for the sound that had become more familiar than my own heartbeat. Sometimes I heard it, faint but unmistakable. Sometimes there was only silence, but even the silence felt pregnant with possibility. I stopped trying to explain the changes to myself. The rational mind wants reasons, wants cause and effect, wants everything to fit into neat categories of real and unreal. But I was living in the spaces between categories now, in the areas where definitions break down and certainty becomes a luxury I could no longer afford. The fifth dream was the longest yet. I floated in that warm, weightless space for what felt like hours, listening to voices that were becoming clearer with each visit. I still couldn't understand the individual words, but I was beginning to grasp the emotional content. There was kindness in those voices, a gentle concern that reminded me of being cared for as a child. But there was also something else, something that felt like anticipation. They were preparing me for something. Each dream was a step in a process I didn't fully comprehend but was beginning to accept. The touches, the lights, the careful mapping of my body and mind, it was all leading towards some moment of completion. I didn't know what that moment would bring, but I no longer feared it. Fear had become as irrelevant as time, as meaningless as the distinction between sleeping and waking. When I opened my eyes in my own bed, I realized something had changed fundamentally. The apartment around me looked the same, but it felt different, less solid somehow, as if it were a stage set rather than a real place. I got up and walked through the rooms, touching familiar objects that no longer felt quite familiar. Everything was exactly where it should be, but nothing was quite right. The marks on my skin had evolved again. The random dots and lines had organized themselves into more complex patterns, geometric shapes that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. They didn't look like anything that belonged on human skin, but they felt natural, as if this was how I was supposed to look, as if the unmarked skin of my past had been the aberration. I called in sick to work, not because I felt ill, but because the pretense of normal life had become unbearable. I couldn't sit in meetings and discuss quarterly reports when my body was transforming into something unprecedented. I couldn't make small talk about weather and weekend plans when my dreams were more real than my waking life. Instead, I spent the day preparing. I wasn't sure what I was preparing for, but the need was urgent and undeniable. I cleaned the apartment thoroughly, arranging everything with a precision that surprised me. I organized my belongings according to principles I didn't consciously understand, but that felt absolutely correct. I was getting ready for visitors, though no one was scheduled to come. The sixth dream began before I was fully asleep. The transition was so smooth I barely noticed it happening. One moment I was lying in bed, looking up at the ceiling, and the next moment the ceiling had dissolved into that familiar darkness punctuated by oval light. The boundaries between states of consciousness had become so thin they were practically non-existent. This time I could see them, not clearly, not in any way that would allow me to describe them to another person, but I could perceive their presence. They moved around me with purpose and efficiency, their attention focused but not unkind. They had been with me all along, I realized, not just in the dreams, but in the spaces between dreams, in the quiet moments when I felt watched but saw no one. They had been waiting for me to notice them, waiting for me to become ready for this level of contact. The dreams had been a gradual introduction, a way of preparing my mind for a reality it wouldn't have been able to accept all at once. Now I was ready. Now I could see them without the protective filter of sleep. One of them approached me, and I felt that familiar sensation of gentle, scientific touch. But this time I could see the hand that touched me, could perceive the intelligence behind the contact. There was nothing frightening about it. If anything, it felt like coming home after a long journey to a place I'd forgotten I'd ever left. They spoke to me, and for the first time I understood, not the words themselves, which were in no language I recognized, but the meaning behind them. They had been looking for me, searching through the noise and chaos of human consciousness for minds that could make this transition. I was one of the few who could bridge the gap between what was and what was becoming. The process was almost complete, they told me. Soon I would be able to move freely between their world and this one, to serve as a translator between different forms of existence. I would retain my human appearance, my human memories, but I would no longer be limited by human perception. I would see reality as it actually was, not filtered through the narrow bandwidth of ordinary consciousness. When I woke up, I wasn't in my bed. I was standing in the living room, fully dressed, with no memory of getting up or putting on clothes. The apartment around me looked different in the morning light, more vivid, more present, as if I were seeing it clearly for the first time. Every detail was sharp and significant, from the way dust motes danced in the sunbeam to the precise angle of shadows on the wall. I looked down at my hands and saw that the marks on my skin had completed their transformation. They formed intricate patterns that covered my arms and chest, beautiful geometric designs that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. They were no longer marks or blemishes. They were part of me now, as natural and necessary as fingerprints. The humming was constant now, no longer hidden beneath other sounds, but present and audible at all times. It wasn't coming from outside me, I realized. It was coming from within, from some new organ or system that had developed during the nights of dreams and transformation. I was generating the sound myself, broadcasting on frequencies that most humans couldn't perceive. I spent the day exploring this new version of reality. Colors were more saturated, sounds had additional layers of meaning, even the air itself felt different against my skin. I could sense the presence of others like me, scattered throughout the city, each one a bridge between worlds. We were part of a network now, connected by invisible threads of shared experience. The seventh dream wasn't a dream at all. I lay down in my bed as I had every night, but instead of falling asleep, I simply shifted into that other state of being. The oval light appeared above me, but now I could see it was actually an opening, a doorway between dimensions. The warm glow wasn't coming from a source of illumination. It was the light of another world bleeding through into this one. I rose from my bed, not in dream but in reality, my body becoming weightless as I had experienced so many times before. But this time I retained full consciousness, full awareness of what was happening. I was being invited to cross over, to step through the opening and see what lay on the other side. The voices welcomed me as I approached the light. I could understand them perfectly now, could hear the joy and relief in their tone. They had been waiting so long for someone who could make this journey consciously, who could serve as an ambassador between their realm and the human world. I was the first to complete the transformation successfully. I reached toward the light, feeling its warmth intensify as I drew closer. The opening expanded to accommodate me, revealing glimpses of a reality so beautiful and complex that human language had no words to describe it. This was where I belonged, where I had always belonged. The human world had been just a temporary assignment, a place to develop the skills I would need for this greater purpose. But as I prepared to step through, something made me pause. I turned back toward my apartment, toward the life I was about to leave behind. Everything looked exactly as I had left it, but there was one detail that shouldn't have been there. On my nightstand, next to the bed I had just risen from, was an envelope. The same envelope that had been missing from the mail pile in the hallway, the one that always seemed to belong somewhere else. I picked up the envelope with hands that were no longer entirely human. My name was written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize, but that felt familiar nonetheless. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that made my new understanding of reality shift once again. "Welcome home," it said. "You're right on schedule." The paper was dated yesterday, but the ink was still wet. Story 2. I had been watching the floorboards, eyes tracing the familiar lines where the wood met the wall. The shadows didn't shift, but something in the air felt charged, like a held breath. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the windows, a soft murmur that might have been mistaken for an echo. Each tick of the ceiling fan seemed amplified, its rhythm oddly irregular. My gaze caught the edge of the bookshelf, where the dust had settled uniformly, untouched. Yet something had changed, an inexplicable lightness in the room. That's when I noticed the single bookmark lying on the floor and that it was never mine. I've been trying to piece it together. The memories come in fragments like broken glass reflecting distorted images. Some moments burn bright and clear, others dissolve the instant I try to hold them. I know something happened, but the sequence feels scrambled, like pages torn from a book and scattered by wind. The bookmark, red leather with a thin gold edge. I remember picking it up, feeling its weight between my fingers, too heavy for paper, too light for metal. The texture was wrong somehow, like skin that had been dried in sunlight. When I touched it, there was a warmth that traveled up my arm, settling somewhere behind my sternum. But that might have been later or before. Time doesn't follow the rules it used to. I remember the sound of water dripping, not from a faucet, something else. Each drop seemed to echo in a space larger than the room I was in. The sound would start soft, then grow until it filled my skull, pressing against the inside of my temples. I would turn toward the sound, but there was never any water, just the dripping, constant and deliberate. There was a door I never noticed before, or maybe I had always seen it but never really looked. It stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The gap was too narrow to see through, too wide to ignore. Sometimes I would catch a flicker of light from behind it, like someone striking a match in the distance. But when I approached, my legs felt heavy, as if I were walking through thick syrup. The air in the room had a taste, metallic, like copper pennies held too long on the tongue. It was strongest near the window, where the curtains hung perfectly still despite the wind I could hear outside. I tried opening the window once, or maybe I dreamed I did. The glass wouldn't budge, sealed tight, as if it had never been meant to open. My reflection in that window was wrong. Not obviously, not in a way I could point to and say, there, that's what's different, but wrong nonetheless. Sometimes I would catch myself staring at it, searching for what had changed. The eyes looked back with an expression I didn't remember making. There was humming, low and constant, like electrical wires carrying too much current. It seemed to come from inside the walls, vibrating through the floorboards and up into my bones. I would press my ear to the wall, trying to locate the source, but it would shift, always staying just out of reach. The humming was worse in the dark. I slept, but sleep brought no rest. Dreams bled into waking, and waking felt like drowning in half-remembered visions. I would find myself standing in the middle of the room with no memory of getting up. My feet would be cold against the floorboards, and there would be a taste in my mouth like I had been holding my breath underwater. The bookmark moved, I'm certain of this, though certainty has become a luxury I can barely afford. I would place it on the table and later find it by the door, or tucked between couch cushions, or back on the floor where I first discovered it. Each time it carried that same wrong warmth. Someone had been in the room, not recently, but the presence lingered like smoke in fabric. I could feel the impression of weight on the chair by the window, see the faint outline where someone had leaned against the wall. But when I looked directly, there was nothing. Only when I wasn't trying to see could I sense the shape of what had been there. The light changed quality without changing intensity. It became thicker somehow, more present. Shadows gained weight and substance. The corner by the bookshelf grew darker, not from lack of light, but from an abundance of something else. I began avoiding that corner, though I couldn't say why. My hands shook when I held the bookmark, not from fear, though fear was certainly present, something else. Recognition, maybe, or anticipation. The gold edge caught light that wasn't there, throwing reflections that moved independently of my movements. When I set it down, my palms would be damp with sweat that smelled like rain on hot pavement. There were voices in the humming, not words exactly, but patterns that suggested language, rhythms that felt familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have heard them before. I began to hum along without realizing it, my throat vibrating in harmony with the sound in the walls. When I caught myself doing this, I would stop, but the vibration would continue in my chest for minutes afterward. The door opened wider, just a fraction, but enough that I could see there was no room beyond it. No hallway, no space at all, just an absence that hurt to look at directly. The light that flickered from within wasn't illuminating anything. It was light without purpose, without source, existing only to remind me that darkness wasn't the opposite of what lay beyond that door. I stopped eating, food had no taste, and swallowing became difficult. My throat felt constricted, as if something were wrapped around it just tightly enough to make each breath a conscious effort. Water helped, but only briefly. The metallic taste would return stronger after each glass, coating my tongue and teeth. The bookmark was warm enough to burn. I could feel it through whatever surface it rested on, radiating heat like a coal pulled fresh from fire. But when I touched it, my skin didn't blister. Instead, the warmth spread through me, settling in places I didn't know could feel temperature. Behind my eyes, in the hollow of my throat, between my shoulder blades. Time moved strangely. I would look at the clock and see minutes pass like hours, then blink and find that hours had compressed into heartbeats. The rhythm of the ceiling fan became my only reliable measure of duration, but even that seemed to fluctuate, speeding up and slowing down according to rules I couldn't grasp. I began to understand that the bookmark wasn't just an object. It was a marker, a placeholder for something that had been removed. Like a scar indicating where something had been cut away, it pointed to an absence rather than a presence, but absence of what I couldn't say. The humming grew louder, or my hearing grew sharper. I could distinguish individual frequencies within it now, separate voices in the electrical chorus. Some were higher, almost musical. Others were so low I felt them more than heard them, vibrations that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. My reflection began to lag. I would move my hand, and the reflection would follow a split second later, as if the image had to travel some impossible distance before reaching the glass. Sometimes the reflection would continue moving after I had stopped, completing gestures I hadn't made. The door was half open now. The darkness beyond had texture, like velvet or deep water. Sometimes shapes moved within it, not quite visible but substantial enough to disturb the quality of the emptiness. I found myself drawn to stand before it, though I never remembered making the decision to approach. Sleep became impossible, not because I wasn't tired, but because the boundary between sleeping and waking had dissolved. I would close my eyes and immediately find myself in the room, watching myself sleep. Or I would be awake, fully conscious, but experiencing dreams with the vividness of memory. The bookmark pulsed, a slow, steady rhythm that matched nothing in my body but felt organic nonetheless. Like a heartbeat belonging to something much larger than myself. When I held it, I could feel that rhythm spreading through my arms, synchronizing with my pulse until I couldn't tell which was leading and which was following. I realized now that I was changing, not physically, though my reflections suggested otherwise. Something deeper was being altered, rearranged. The bookmark wasn't just marking a place, it was marking me, identifying me as something other than what I had been. The voices in the humming became clearer, not words in any language I recognized, but communication nonetheless. They were discussing something, debating, planning, and occasionally they would fall silent, as if listening for a response I didn't know I was supposed to give. The door stands fully open now. The darkness beyond isn't empty anymore. It's full of potential, of possibility, of things that exist in the spaces between thoughts. I can see shapes moving within it, patient and purposeful. They've been waiting. I understand that this isn't a room anymore. It never was, really. It's a threshold, a place of transition. The bookmark was never mine because I was never meant to keep it. I was meant to return it, to carry it back to where it belongs. The humming has stopped. The silence is more unsettling than the sound ever was. In the quiet, I can hear my own breathing, ragged and shallow. My heartbeat sounds different now, keeping time with rhythms I'm only beginning to understand. Something is stirring in the depths of my memory, not returning but awakening, like something that has been sleeping inside me, waiting for the right moment to open its eyes. The bookmark grows warm in my hand, and I know the moment is approaching. I can feel myself standing up, though I don't remember deciding to move. My feet carry me toward the open door, toward the darkness that no longer seems empty but full of recognition. The shapes within it are clearer now, more defined. They're reaching toward me, not with menace but with welcome. The bookmark slips from my fingers, but it doesn't fall. It hovers in the air between my hand and the darkness, glowing with that impossible light. I understand now that it was never a bookmark at all. It was a key, and I was never lost. I was coming home. The memory stops there, or maybe it continues, but I can't access what comes next. Not yet, but I can feel it pressing against the edges of my consciousness, patient and inevitable. Soon, I think, soon I'll remember everything. And I'm not sure I want to. Story 3. It wasn't the first time the window was open in the morning. The curtains barely shifted, hanging more out of habit than function. A stray leaf lay on the floor, despite the room being sealed tight the night before. I swept it into the bin without a second thought. The air felt a touch cooler, but the thermostat showed no change. I straightened the cushions on the couch, noting the slight indentation in one of them. The remote control was exactly where it should have been, untouched since yesterday. When I left the room, I made sure to close the door softly. I didn't mind if it stayed ajar. These small inconsistencies started accumulating about 3 weeks ago. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make you call anyone or seek help. Just tiny disruptions in the fabric of routine that felt like echoes of something I couldn't quite grasp. The feeling was similar to waking from a dream you almost remember, where the emotions linger but the details dissolve the moment you try to focus on them. I know something happened to me, something significant enough to leave these residual traces scattered through my daily life like breadcrumbs leading back to a path I can no longer see. The certainty sits in my chest like a weight, pressing against my ribs when I breathe too deeply. But when I try to remember what it was, my mind hits a wall of static, white and buzzing, and completely impenetrable. The gaps in my memory aren't clean. They're jagged, torn edges where something used to be. I can feel the absence of it, the way you can feel the space where a tooth used to be by running your tongue over the empty socket. There's a particular stretch of several hours that exists as nothing more than a blank space in my consciousness, surrounded by the vague impression that those hours were important. I've been trying to piece it together, working backward from these small anomalies. The open windows, the moved objects, the way certain sounds make my skin crawl now, sounds that never bothered me before. The hum of the refrigerator, the whistle of wind through the gaps in the door frame, the soft electronic beep of the smoke detector when its battery runs low. Yesterday I found something that made me stop what I was doing and sit down hard on the kitchen floor. It was tucked behind a container of flour in the pantry, something I never would have discovered if I hadn't been reorganizing the shelves. A small digital recorder, the kind you might use for interviews or taking voice memos. I didn't remember buying it. I didn't remember ever owning one. The device felt warm in my palm, as if it had been recently used. When I pressed the power button, it came to life immediately, its small screen glowing pale green in the dim pantry light. There was one file saved on it, labeled only with a series of numbers that meant nothing to me. My finger hovered over the play button for a long time before I finally pressed it. My own voice filled the small space, but it sounded strange, distant, like I was speaking from the bottom of a well or through a thick layer of glass. The words were unclear at first, muffled by what sounded like interference or static. But as I listened more carefully, adjusting the volume and holding the speaker close to my ear, I began to make out fragments. "The lights are moving in patterns," my recorded voice whispered, barely audible above a low electronic hum that seemed to pulse in rhythm with something I couldn't identify. "They're not random. There's definitely a sequence. I need to remember this. I need to remember everything because I can feel it starting to slip away already." The recording continued for several more minutes, but most of it was unintelligible. Occasionally, my voice would surface above the static, urgent and breathless. "Behind me," I heard myself say at one point. "Something behind me, but when I turn there's nothing there." Later, "The air smells wrong, like new plastic and cold blood." When the file ended, I sat in the pantry for a long time, staring at the recorder. I had no memory of making that recording, none at all, but it was undeniably my voice, and the fear in it was real and immediate, as if whatever I had been experiencing was happening in real time. That night I played the recording again, this time with headphones, trying to isolate different layers of sound. Beneath my voice and the electronic interference there were other noises, soft scraping sounds like something being dragged across a hard surface. A rhythmic tapping that could have been footsteps, but the intervals were wrong, too long between each step. And underneath it all, so faint I might have imagined it, something that sounded almost like breathing. The breathing bothered me more than anything else. It wasn't human breathing, wasn't the natural rhythm of lungs expanding and contracting. It was mechanical, deliberate, with pauses that lasted too long and exhalations that seemed to go on forever. When I finally took off the headphones, my hands were shaking. I started having flashes after that, brief, vivid images that would surface without warning, usually when I was doing something mundane like washing dishes or folding laundry. They felt like memories, but they were fragmentary and surreal, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. In one flash, I was standing in my living room, but the furniture was arranged differently. The couch was pushed against the far wall, and the coffee table was missing entirely. The room was lit by a series of bright white lights that moved slowly across the walls and ceiling, casting sharp shadows that shifted and danced in ways that defied the movement of the light sources. I could hear that electronic humming again, rising and falling in pitch like a voice trying to form words. In another fragment, I was looking down at my hands, but they didn't look like my hands. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and I could see the network of veins beneath the surface pulsing with a rhythm that didn't match my heartbeat. When I tried to move my fingers, there was a delay, as if the signal from my brain was traveling through thick liquid before reaching my extremities. The most disturbing flash came while I was making coffee one morning. Suddenly I was back in my bedroom, but the walls were covered with what looked like condensation, droplets of moisture that caught and reflected light in impossible ways. The air was thick and hard to breathe, and there was a presence behind me, something large and patient that watched without making a sound. When I tried to turn around to see what it was, my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, frozen in place while something approached from behind, its footsteps making that same wrong rhythm I had heard on the recording. The flash lasted only seconds, but when it ended, I was gripping the edge of the kitchen counter so hard my knuckles had gone white. The coffee maker was beeping insistently, having finished its cycle while I was lost in the memory. I poured the coffee with trembling hands and noticed that my reflection in the chrome surface of the machine looked strange. Not wrong exactly, but slightly off, as if the image was delayed by a fraction of a second. I started paying more attention to reflections after that, in windows, in mirrors, in any surface that could show me back to myself. Most of the time, everything appeared normal, but occasionally there would be tiny discrepancies. My reflection would blink a moment after I did, or it would turn its head slightly in a direction I hadn't moved. Once I caught my reflection smiling when I was certain my face was neutral. The sounds started changing too. The familiar background noise of my house began to feel different, charged with significance I couldn't understand. The hum of the refrigerator would sometimes shift in pitch, dropping to a lower frequency that made my teeth ache. The whistle of wind through the window frames developed a musical quality, as if it was trying to play a melody I should recognize. Late one night, I was lying in bed listening to these sounds when I heard something new. A soft tapping like fingernails against glass. It seemed to be coming from the window, but when I got up to investigate, there was nothing there. The tapping continued, moving around the room as if whatever was making the sound was walking along the walls. I followed it with my eyes, tracking its progress across the ceiling and down the opposite wall, but I could see nothing that could be causing it. The tapping stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence I heard my own voice whisper, "You're remembering now, aren't you?" But I hadn't spoken. I was certain I hadn't spoken. My mouth was closed, my lips pressed together. Yet the words had definitely been in my voice, coming from somewhere behind my left shoulder. When I turned to look, there was nothing there but the empty room and my own shadow cast by the streetlight filtering through the curtains. I found more recordings after that, not on the device I had discovered in the pantry, but scattered throughout the house in places that made no sense. One was tucked inside a book I hadn't opened in months. Another was taped to the underside of a kitchen drawer. A third was hidden in the pocket of a coat I rarely wore. Each recording was similar to the first, but contained different fragments of information. In one, I described lights that moved in complex geometric patterns, tracing shapes in the air that hurt to look at directly. In another, I talked about the way time seemed to stretch and compress, how minutes felt like hours and hours collapsed into seconds. A third recording captured me trying to describe a sound that I claimed was like music, but not music. Like a song being sung in reverse by something that doesn't have a mouth. The most unsettling recording was also the shortest. It contained only a few seconds of audio, but those seconds were crystal clear, without any of the static or interference that plagued the others. In it, I heard my own voice say, with perfect calm and clarity, "I understand now. I understand what they want me to forget." The recording ended there, cutting off abruptly as if the device had been switched off mid-sentence. I played it over and over, searching for some clue about what I might have understood, but there was nothing else. Just those words, spoken with a certainty and knowledge that I no longer possessed. As I continued to investigate, the boundary between past and present began to blur. The flashes of memory became more frequent and more vivid, sometimes lasting for minutes at a time. During these episodes, I would find myself experiencing events that felt completely real but made no logical sense. In one extended flash, I was standing in my backyard, but the sky was wrong. Instead of blue or gray or any color a sky should be, it was a deep, shifting purple that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. The trees around the perimeter of the yard were moving without wind, their branches swaying in slow, hypnotic patterns that reminded me of seaweed drifting in an underwater current. I could hear voices in this memory, multiple voices speaking in unison, but the words were in a language I didn't recognize. The sounds were harsh and angular, like broken glass being ground together, yet somehow musical. As I listened, I began to understand that the voices were asking me questions, though I couldn't comprehend the specific words. I found myself answering in the same strange language, my mouth forming sounds that felt foreign on my tongue. When the flash ended, I was standing in my actual backyard, but it was the middle of the night and I was barefoot. I had no memory of coming outside. My feet were cold and damp from the grass, and there were small cuts on the soles that suggested I had been walking on rough ground. When I looked up at the sky, it was perfectly normal, black and dotted with stars, but for a moment I could swear I saw traces of that impossible purple color lingering at the edges of my vision. The cuts on my feet healed quickly, but they left behind small white scars that formed an unusual pattern. When I examined them closely with a magnifying glass, I realized they weren't random. The scars created a series of interconnected lines and circles that looked almost like a diagram or a map of something I couldn't identify. I started drawing these patterns, trying to understand what they might represent. I filled page after page with variations of the design, each version slightly different but maintaining the same basic structure. The more I drew, the more familiar the patterns became, as if I was remembering something I had once known intimately. While I was working on these drawings one evening, I heard the electronic humming again. This time it wasn't coming from a recording or a memory. It was present in the room with me, rising from no identifiable source. The sound grew louder and more complex, developing harmonies and overtones that created an almost hypnotic effect. As I listened, the patterns I had been drawing began to make sense. I could see how each line connected to the others, how the circles represented nodes in some kind of network or system. The knowledge came to me gradually, like water seeping through a crack, until I understood that what I was looking at was a map of my own house. But it wasn't a map of the house as it existed in normal space. It was a map of the house as it existed in some other dimension or state of being, where the rooms were connected by pathways that defied physical laws, and the walls were permeable to things that shouldn't be able to pass through them. According to this map, there were spaces in my house that didn't correspond to any room I knew about. Hidden areas that existed between the walls, beneath the floors, above the ceilings. And in these spaces, something was waiting. The humming grew louder, and I felt a familiar presence behind me. This time I didn't try to turn around. I knew that if I looked, I would see something that my mind wasn't equipped to process, something that would complete the picture of what had happened to me, but at a cost I wasn't prepared to pay. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the memory wash over me. I remembered the night everything changed, the night when my house had become something else entirely, and I had been taken on a journey through spaces that existed outside of normal reality. I remembered the lights and the sounds, and the presence that had guided me through rooms that were somehow both familiar and completely alien. Most importantly, I remembered the choice I had been given. I could keep the memory of what I had experienced, but it would change me in ways that would make it impossible to continue living a normal life. Or I could forget, let the knowledge be carefully extracted from my mind, and return to my ordinary existence with only fragments and echoes to remind me that something extraordinary had occurred. I had chosen to forget, but the process hadn't been perfect. Pieces of the experience had remained, scattered through my consciousness like seeds that were now beginning to sprout. As this understanding crystallized, I felt something shift in the air around me. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and expectant. When I opened my eyes, the drawings on the table in front of me had changed. The lines were moving, slowly rearranging themselves into new configurations that hurt to look at directly. I realized that by remembering, by piecing together the fragments they had left behind, I had triggered something. The process was starting again. The choice was being offered to me once more. But this time I wasn't sure what I would choose. The ordinary world felt thin and insubstantial now, like a photograph that had been exposed to too much light. I could see through it to the deeper structures beneath, the hidden geometries that connected all things in ways that defied explanation. Behind me I heard the sound of breathing that wasn't quite human, patient, waiting. The window in the living room was open again, though I was certain I had closed it. The curtains hung motionless in air that carried the faint scent of new plastic and cold blood. I turned the page to a fresh sheet of paper and picked up my pen. There were more patterns to draw, more fragments to piece together, and somewhere in the spaces between memory and forgetting, something was watching me work, counting down to the moment when I would have to choose again. The question wasn't whether I would remember everything. The question was whether I would still be myself when I did. Story 4. The initial inventory inspection commenced at 1800 hours. Rows of identical boxes lined the shelves, each barcode meticulously recorded. Scanning devices showed all items present and accounted for according to the digital ledger. Temperature controls remained constant, unwavering between documented check-ins. Dust gathered in corners, undisturbed by recent movements. An unopened delivery sat inconspicuously by the entrance, logged but lacking a corresponding dispatch record. All lights functioned properly, though the power indicator flickered irregularly. Exit routes were unobstructed, yet the motion sensors failed to register any activity. The air vent emitted a low hum, yet the security footage looped back 2 minutes. I remember writing that report, my handwriting, my observations, my signature at the bottom, but I don't remember being there. The taste of copper fills my mouth when I think about that warehouse. Not blood, something cleaner, sharper, like licking a battery that hasn't died yet. My tongue finds the spot where my teeth meet, pressing, searching for the source of that metallic tang that visits me in quiet moments. Sleep doesn't come easy anymore. When it does, I dream of fluorescent lights that buzz with voices I can't understand. The sound sits behind my molars, vibrating through bone. I wake with my jaw clenched so tight my temples throb. There were lights behind the trees. The warehouse sits 20 minutes from where I live, down a road I've driven 1,000 times. But lately, the drive feels longer. Sometimes I arrive and realize I don't remember the journey. Other times, I find myself pulling into the parking lot without meaning to go there at all. The boxes on the shelves, rows and rows of them. I know their contents by heart, office supplies, cleaning materials, replacement parts for equipment I've never seen. But when I dream about them, they're different, heavier. The cardboard breathes, expanding and contracting like lungs filled with something thicker than air. I don't remember ever coming back. My supervisor asked me about the report, why I mentioned the 2-minute loop in the security footage. I stared at the words on the page, my own handwriting, and felt my skin grow cold. The footage runs continuously, he said, always has. No loops, no gaps, no glitches. But I remember watching the timestamp. 18:03:47, 18:03:48, 18:03:49, then back to 18:01:52, over and over. The same 2 minutes playing while I stood there, scanner in hand, counting boxes that multiplied when I wasn't looking directly at them. The air vent, that low hum. It follows me home sometimes, threading through the walls of my apartment, weaving between the spaces where silence should live. I press my ear against the bathroom wall, the kitchen ceiling, searching for the source. The sound moves, always one room ahead of where I am. The noise didn't come from outside. My reflection looks wrong in certain lights, not dramatically, just slightly off, like a photograph printed with the wrong color balance. My eyes seem darker, set deeper. My skin has a pallor that wasn't there before. I catch myself staring, trying to remember what I used to look like, but the memory slides away like water through fingers. The unopened delivery by the entrance. I documented it, logged it, noted the absence of corresponding dispatch records. Standard procedure. But the box haunts my peripheral vision, sitting in that same spot every time I visit the warehouse. Never moved, never opened, never claimed. The shipping label bears an address that doesn't exist on any map I can find. Time moves strangely when I'm there. Minutes stretch into hours or compress into seconds. I'll check my watch at the beginning of my shift and find that either no time has passed or that I've somehow lost 3 hours without noticing. The sun sits in the wrong part of the sky when I finally leave. There were lights behind the trees. The tingling started in my fingertips, a gentle electric current that pulses in rhythm with my heartbeat. It spreads up my arms when I touch certain things: door handles, light switches, the scanner I use for inventory. Metal objects hold the sensation longest, warming under my palms in ways that have nothing to do with body heat. I dream of walking through the warehouse at night. The motion sensors that failed to register activity during my inspection track my movements perfectly in these dreams, red lights blinking in sequence as I move between the aisles. But I'm not alone. Footsteps echo mine, always one beat behind, always just out of sight around the corner. The dust in the corners, undisturbed, I wrote, but dust doesn't gather in perfect geometric patterns. It doesn't form symbols that shift when viewed from different angles. It doesn't whisper when the air conditioning kicks on. I don't remember ever coming back. My coworkers mention things I don't remember doing, conversations I don't recall having, days when they say I was there, moving through my routines, completing my tasks, but existing in a space just adjacent to my own consciousness. They describe me as distant, distracted, responding to questions with answers that made sense but felt rehearsed. The power indicator that flickered irregularly. I documented it, but now I wonder what it was trying to communicate. The pattern seemed random at first, but repetition reveals rhythm. Short flashes, long flashes, pauses that stretch just long enough to make you think it stopped. A language of light that my conscious mind can't decode, but my dreams understand perfectly. The taste of copper intensifies when I think about that night. Not the shift I documented, but another night, or maybe the same night viewed from a different angle. I remember standing in the warehouse, but the perspective is wrong, too high, as if I'm looking down at myself from the ceiling. Watching my own body move through the aisles, scanning barcodes, counting inventory, while something else operates the controls. The noise didn't come from outside. Temperature controls remained constant, I wrote, but I remember feeling cold. The kind of cold that starts in your bones and works its way out, making your skin tight and your breath visible in air that should be warm. My hands shook as I held the scanner, not from fear, but from something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or remembrance of something I was supposed to forget. The exit routes were unobstructed, but I couldn't find them. Every aisle led to another aisle. Every door opened onto the same room. The warehouse expanded beyond its physical boundaries, stretching into spaces that shouldn't exist, filled with boxes that contained things that had no names. I dream of the air vent, but in my dreams it's not emitting sound, it's breathing. The metal grill expands and contracts, drawing air in and pushing it out with deliberate rhythm. Sometimes I hear my name being called from inside the ductwork, but the voice is my own, speaking words I never said. There were lights behind the trees. The security footage loops back 2 minutes. I know this even though my supervisor insists otherwise. I've seen it happen, watched the timestamp reset, observed the same sequence of events play out while I stood frozen in a moment that refused to move forward. But the cameras don't record these loops. They show continuous footage of an empty warehouse, no sign of the person who wrote the report. My handwriting, but not my presence. My observations, but not my experience. My signature on a document that describes events I participated in but can't remember. The metallic taste grows stronger. My reflection continues to shift in lights that seem brighter than they should be. The tingling in my fingertips spreads up my arms, across my shoulders, down my spine. Every sensation circles back to that warehouse, to those 2 minutes that loop endlessly in a footage that doesn't exist. I don't remember ever coming back. But I'm going back tonight. I can feel it in the copper taste on my tongue, in the electric current under my skin, in the humming that follows me from room to room. The warehouse waits, patient and unchanged, with its rows of identical boxes and its unopened delivery and its motion sensors that register nothing. The initial inventory inspection will commence at 1800 hours. I know this, though I don't remember scheduling it. I'll document the boxes, scan the barcodes, note the temperature controls. I'll observe the dust in corners, undisturbed by recent movements. I'll record the flickering power indicator and the low hum from the air vent. And the security footage will loop back 2 minutes. The noise didn't come from outside, story 5. I brushed the thin layer of dust from the tabletop and felt a chill run through my fingers. Each particle seemed to clamor for attention, betraying a presence that shouldn't have been. The creak of the wooden floor beneath me was only a shadow in my peripheral awareness. My skin rose with goosebumps as if the room exhaled a secret. The air tasted older, more muted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the dust carried stories I wasn't meant to hear. That was 3 weeks ago, or maybe 4. The days blur together now, each one feeling like I'm walking through someone else's dream. I know something happened to me, something that carved out pieces of my memory with surgical precision, leaving behind only the phantom ache of missing thoughts. I wake up different, not visibly, not in ways others would notice, but I feel the absence like a tooth that's been pulled. My tongue keeps probing the empty space, searching for what used to be there. The mirror shows the same face, but behind my eyes there's a quality I don't recognize. A wariness, as if I'm constantly listening for something just beyond the edge of hearing. The apartment feels foreign sometimes. I'll walk into my own kitchen and pause, momentarily unsure why I came in. Objects seem displaced by inches, though I can't prove anything has moved. My coffee mug sits where I always leave it. My books remain in their familiar rows, but there's a wrongness that settles over everything like a film. I started recording myself, voice memos on my phone, rambling observations about the gaps in my memory. Maybe if I talked through it enough, the missing pieces would surface. The recordings pile up, hours of my own voice circling around the same hollow space, trying to map the edges of what I can't remember. That's when I found the file I didn't record. It appeared between 2 of my own memos, labeled with a timestamp that made no sense. The audio quality was different, distorted, like it had been captured through water. I pressed play, and my own voice emerged from the speaker, but wrong somehow. The cadence was off, the words slurred together in places. "The lights keep changing," my voice said, but I had no memory of speaking those words. "They're not supposed to move like that. Geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. I think they know I'm watching." Static crackled through the recording. In the background, I could hear something else. A low humming that seemed to shift frequencies, rising and falling in waves that made my teeth ache. And underneath that, barely audible, what sounded like whispers in a language I couldn't identify. The recording cut off abruptly. I played it again and again until the sound of my own distorted voice began to feel like listening to a stranger. But each time, fragments would surface. Not full memories, but impressions. Flashes of light that moved with impossible fluidity. The sensation of standing in a space much larger than any room should be. The taste of copper pennies on my tongue. The first real fragment came while I was washing dishes. My hands were submerged in warm, soapy water when suddenly the temperature changed. Not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. The water felt thick, viscous, and when I looked down it was perfectly clear, but my reflection was wrong. My face looked back at me with an expression I wasn't making, eyes focused on something behind me. I spun around. The kitchen was empty. When I turned back to the sink, the water was normal again, and my reflection matched my movements. But the memory fragment lingered. I remembered standing in darkness, watching lights dance across a surface that might have been water or might have been something else entirely. The lights moved in patterns that suggested intelligence, forming shapes that almost made sense before dissolving into chaos. In the fragment, I was not alone. There were others around me, but when I tried to focus on them, they became indistinct, like figures seen through frosted glass. We were all watching the lights, all silent, but I could feel their breathing synchronized with mine. The air was thick with anticipation, or maybe dread. And then nothing. The fragment ended as abruptly as it began, leaving me standing at my sink with pruned fingers and a growing certainty that whatever I was remembering had been carefully extracted from my mind. I started documenting everything, every strange sensation, every moment when reality seemed to shift slightly out of focus. The notebook filled with observations that read like the ravings of someone losing their grip, but I couldn't stop writing. The act of recording felt important, as if I was rebuilding something that had been deliberately dismantled. The second fragment came through smell. I was walking past a construction site when the wind shifted, carrying the scent of fresh plastic and something metallic and cold. The combination hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly I was somewhere else. A room with walls that seemed to breathe. The plastic smell was overwhelming, mixed with something that reminded me of blood but wasn't quite right, too clean, too sharp. I was sitting in a chair that vibrated slightly, irregularly, like a phone on silent mode. The vibration traveled through my bones, making my vision blur at the edges. There were sounds, electronic tones that shifted frequency without warning, creating harmonics that made my inner ear ache. Static that sounded almost like breathing, rhythmic and deliberate. And underneath it all, that same low humming from the recording, but now I could feel it in my chest, resonating with my heartbeat until I couldn't tell which rhythm was my own. Someone was speaking, but the words came through layers of distortion. The voice was familiar, might have been my own, but the meaning slipped away even as I tried to grasp it. I had the impression of instructions being given, of responses being recorded, but the content remained frustratingly out of reach. The fragment ended when a car backfired nearby, jerking me back to the present. I stood on the sidewalk, shaking, while pedestrians flowed around me like water around a stone. The construction site looked perfectly normal, but the smell lingered in my nostrils for hours afterward. That night I dreamed of lights again, but these weren't the dancing patterns from the first fragment. These were harsh, clinical, flooding my vision with white intensity. I tried to close my eyes in the dream, but the light penetrated my eyelids, burning afterimages into my retinas. When I woke, phantom flashes continued to pulse behind my closed eyes for several minutes. The dreams became a nightly occurrence, always the same blinding light, always the same sense of being observed, catalogued, recorded. I started sleeping with a notebook beside the bed, scribbling down whatever I could remember upon waking. Most of it was incoherent, but patterns began to emerge. References to procedures I couldn't recall, mentions of responses and reactions being measured, and repeatedly the phrase subject compliance maintained, written in my own handwriting but in a style I didn't recognize. The present began to bleed into the fragments. I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. Reflections in windows showed rooms with different lighting than the ones I was actually in. My phone would buzz with notifications that disappeared when I checked the screen. The vibrations started during the third week. Subtle at first, barely noticeable tremors in whatever I was holding. My coffee cup would pulse gently against my palm. Door handles would thrum with barely perceptible energy. Even my pen would quiver slightly as I wrote, making my handwriting look uncertain and shaky. The vibrations followed no pattern I could identify. They would start and stop seemingly at random, lasting anywhere from seconds to hours. I began to suspect they were connected to the fragments, some kind of trigger or response mechanism that I couldn't consciously control. It was during one of these episodes that the third fragment surfaced. I was holding my phone, feeling it buzz irregularly in my hand, when the screen flickered and showed me something that wasn't there. For just a moment, instead of my home screen, I saw a view of myself from above. I was lying on what looked like a medical table, but the perspective was wrong, as if the camera was mounted on the ceiling but somehow looking through it at the same time. My eyes were open in the image, but they were focused on something beyond the frame. My mouth was moving, forming words I couldn't hear, and there were leads or wires attached to my temples. The lighting was that same harsh, clinical white from my dreams, but now I could see it casting shadows that didn't match the objects creating them. The image lasted maybe 3 seconds before my phone returned to normal, but the fragment it triggered was longer and more vivid than the others. I remembered the table, the feeling of cold metal against my skin. The leads were connected to something that hummed and clicked, processing information I was apparently providing. I could hear my own voice, but from outside my body, as if I was both participant and observer. The questions came in that distorted, layered voice I'd heard in the fragments before. Not words exactly, but concepts that bypassed language and spoke directly to some deeper part of my mind. I found myself responding, but not with speech. The answers seemed to flow out of me through channels I didn't know I possessed. And throughout it all, that sense of being recorded, catalogued, filed away for future reference. Every response, every involuntary reaction, every micro-expression was being captured and analyzed by intelligences that felt vast and patient and utterly alien to human experience. The fragment ended with the sensation of something being removed, not physically extracted, but carefully edited out, like a film editor cutting unwanted scenes from a movie. I could feel the precise moment when memories were severed from their connections, leaving behind only the faint scars I was now trying to read. When I came back to myself, I was sitting on my kitchen floor with my phone beside me. The screen was cracked, though I had no memory of dropping it. My hands were shaking, and there was a taste in my mouth like I'd been chewing on aluminum foil. I picked up the phone and tried to access the image I'd seen, but there was no record of it in my photos or browser history. The crack in the screen formed a pattern that looked almost deliberate, like a map of somewhere I'd never been but somehow recognized. The fragments were becoming more frequent, more intense. They would strike without warning, triggered by sounds, smells, textures that seemed perfectly ordinary but contained some hidden significance my conscious mind couldn't grasp. Each one revealed another piece of the puzzle, but instead of clarification, I felt increasingly lost in a maze of partial memories and impossible experiences. I started to suspect that the investigation itself was being monitored. Sometimes I would return home to find my notebook moved slightly, or my phone displaying apps I didn't remember opening. The paranoia might have been a side effect of whatever had been done to me, but it felt rational, justified by evidence I couldn't quite articulate. The final fragment came without warning, without any external trigger I could identify. I was simply sitting in my chair, writing in my notebook, when reality shifted around me like a kaleidoscope turning. Suddenly I was back in that breathing room, but now I could see more of it. The walls weren't walls at all, but surfaces that rippled and flowed like liquid mercury. The chair I sat in was part of a larger apparatus, connected by cables and conduits to machinery that defied any attempt at comprehension. The vibrations I'd been feeling weren't random, they were part of a larger rhythm, a pulse that connected me to systems beyond my understanding. But it was the clarity of this fragment that disturbed me most. Unlike the others, which had been hazy and distorted, this memory was sharp, detailed, impossible to dismiss as imagination or hallucination. I could see the serial numbers on equipment, red displays showing data streams I couldn't interpret, feel the exact temperature of the air against my skin. And I could see the others. Not the indistinct figures from earlier fragments, but clear, recognizable people. They sat in identical chairs, connected to identical machines, their faces wearing the same expression of distant compliance I must have worn myself. Some I recognized from the street, from the grocery store, from the coffee shop I frequented. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that pieces of their experience had been carefully removed and filed away. In the fragment, I turned my head, something I hadn't been able to do in the previous memories, and looked directly at one of the observers. It stood just outside the circle of chairs, tall and impossibly thin, its features shifting whenever I tried to focus on them. When our eyes met, it tilted its head in what might have been curiosity or amusement. And then it spoke, not with the distorted voice from the recordings, but in clear, unaccented words that bypassed my ears entirely and appeared fully formed in my mind. The reconstruction phase is proceeding as expected, it said. Subject is integrating the permitted memories without significant resistance. Recommend proceeding to the next stage. The fragment ended there, cutting off so abruptly that I gasped and found myself back in my chair, pen still in hand, notebook open to a page covered with writing I didn't remember doing. The words were in my handwriting but formed sentences I had never consciously composed. The fragments are not memories I had written. They are breadcrumbs leading me deeper into a maze I was never meant to escape. Each piece I recover brings me closer to something that was deliberately hidden, something that was removed not to protect me, but to protect them. Below that, in letters that grew increasingly erratic, They are still watching. They never stopped watching. The investigation was always part of the plan. I stared at the words until they seemed to writhe on the page. My phone buzzed once, then fell silent. In the reflection of its black screen, I could see my face, but my expression was wrong again, focused on something behind me that I knew wasn't there but couldn't bring myself to turn around and confirm. The vibrations in my hand intensified, spreading up my arm like electricity, and I realized with crystalline clarity that the reconstruction was not something I was doing to recover my memories. It was something being done to me, and I had no idea what would happen when it was complete. The notebook fell from my numb fingers, pages fluttering open to reveal more writing in my hand, words I had never chosen to write but somehow knew to be true. Phase 2 begins now, Story 6. There was a time when I dismissed it as mere coincidence, something that existed in the periphery of my daily routine. Every morning while sipping my coffee, I'd notice a pair of shoes left outside the neighboring door, the same pair, side by side, always facing the same direction. Yet one day the left shoe was inexplicably turned at an angle. I shrugged it off at first, until it happened again, the same shoe, now slightly scuffed. Yesterday I noticed a new pair, but only one shoe was there. The other had vanished, leaving behind a hint of unease I can't quite shake. That unease has become my constant companion now. I find myself checking those shoes obsessively, but they've stopped changing. They sit there perfectly aligned as if nothing ever happened. The silence from next door has grown heavier, more deliberate. Sometimes I press my ear against the wall we share, but there's nothing. Not the shuffle of footsteps, not the creak of floorboards, not even the hum of appliances. Just this profound emptiness that seems to push back against my listening. My sleep has fractured into fragments. I wake at intervals throughout what I assume is night, though I've stopped looking at timepieces. There's this persistent sensation that something is watching me through the walls, through the ceiling, from angles that shouldn't exist. The air in my room feels thicker now, almost viscous, and sometimes I catch myself holding my breath without realizing it. The electronics have begun their strange behavior again. My radio turns itself on, cycling through static until it finds that frequency that isn't quite white noise. It's more structured than static, like a pattern trying to emerge from chaos. My phone's screen flickers with messages that disappear before I can read them, leaving only the afterimage burned briefly into my retinas. The refrigerator's hum has changed pitch, becoming something that resonates in my chest cavity. Nobody believes me when I try to explain. They suggest stress, overwork, maybe I should see someone professional. But how do you explain the way shadows fall wrong in your apartment now, or how the temperature drops exactly 3 degrees every time you walk past a certain spot near the window? How do you describe the metallic taste that coats your tongue when you wake up, or the way your reflection sometimes seems to lag behind your movements in the bathroom mirror? I've been trying to remember when this all started, working backward through the fog that seems to have settled over my memory. There was that period when I thought I was losing time. I'd sit down to eat breakfast and suddenly find myself standing in the kitchen with an empty plate in my hands, no memory of consuming anything. The taste of food became distant, like chewing cardboard flavored with aluminum. The humming started before the time loss, I think. It was so subtle at first, just barely perceptible, like the sound of electricity running through walls, but it wasn't coming from the walls. It seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper, from the space between spaces. I'd walk around my apartment trying to locate the source, pressing my ear to surfaces, but it would shift, always staying just out of reach. That's when I began noticing the light patterns. Every evening, just as the sun would disappear behind the building across the street, there would be this glow. Not harsh, not bright, just a soft illumination that seemed to seep through the windows despite the curtains being drawn. It had a quality unlike any light I'd experienced, almost liquid in the way it moved across surfaces, pooling in corners and flowing along the edges of furniture. The building's electrical system started acting strangely around the same time. Lights in the hallway would flicker in sequence, creating a pattern that almost looked deliberate. The elevator would arrive at my floor without being called, doors opening to reveal an empty car that smelled faintly of ozone. Sometimes I'd step inside out of curiosity, but the buttons wouldn't respond to my touch, and after standing there for long moments, the doors would close and the elevator would descend without stopping. I remember now the night when everything felt different. I was lying in bed, not quite asleep but not fully awake when the vibration started. It was so gentle at first, like a large truck passing on a distant highway, but it continued, steady and rhythmic, coming up through the floor and into the mattress. My water glass on the nightstand began to ripple in perfect concentric circles. The vibration seemed to sync with something inside my chest, and I found myself breathing in time with it. There was a strange comfort in the rhythm, almost hypnotic. My eyelids grew heavy, but not with ordinary sleepiness. This was different, deeper, like being pulled down into warm water. The last thing I remember from that night was the sensation of weightlessness, as if the bed had begun to float. But even before that night, there had been signs I didn't recognize as signs. The nausea that would hit me in waves, always in the same spot near the kitchen window. The way my peripheral vision would catch movement that wasn't there when I turned to look. The smell of copper pennies that would drift through the apartment at irregular intervals, strongest near the door that led to the hallway. I'd been having trouble with coordination, dropping things more frequently, stumbling over furniture that had been in the same position for months. My hands would shake sometimes, just a slight tremor, but it felt like it was coming from somewhere other than my nervous system. Like something was moving through me, using my body as a conduit. The temperature changes were subtle at first. I'd notice goosebumps on my arms despite the thermostat reading normal, or I'd feel uncomfortably warm in rooms that should have been cool. The air itself seemed to have texture, sometimes smooth and sometimes granular against my skin. I started wearing long sleeves even indoors, not for warmth, but to create a barrier between myself and whatever was in the air. Looking back further, I can see how it all began so innocuously. I'd been feeling more tired than usual, going to bed earlier, sleeping longer, but waking up less refreshed. My appetite had shifted. Foods I'd always enjoyed tasting flat and unappetizing. I attributed it to seasonal changes, maybe a mild illness coming on. The first real anomaly was so small I almost missed it entirely. I was sitting by the window reading when I noticed the quality of light had changed. Not dimmer or brighter, just different somehow, as if it was coming from a source with a slightly different spectrum. The pages of my book looked the same, but the shadows they cast seemed more defined, more present. I remember setting the book down and looking outside, trying to identify what was causing the change. The sky appeared normal, the usual mix of clouds and clear patches, but there was something in my peripheral vision, just at the edge of what I could perceive. When I tried to focus on it directly, it would slip away, like trying to look at a dim star that disappears when you stare at it. That was the beginning, though I didn't know it then. I was simply living my life, going through my routines, unaware that something had begun to take notice. The apartment felt safe, familiar, filled with the accumulated comfort of daily habits. I would make my coffee, check those shoes next door, settle into my chair by the window to read. Everything was normal then, beautifully, terrifyingly normal, and I had no idea that something was already watching, already planning, already beginning its slow and patient approach. Story 7. It was the scent of overripe oranges that greeted me, clinging to the air in the hallway. Sweet, almost intoxicating, yet distinctly out of place in a house that hadn't seen fresh fruit in weeks. I hesitated at the threshold, the unexpected aroma unraveling a string of memories I had long secured away. The walls seemed to lean in as if drawn by my confusion, and for a moment the hallway appeared narrower, tighter. I moved forward, drawn by a compulsion to find the source. The air grew dense with the scent, each step thickening the atmosphere. I remembered that smell from another house, another time, when the past felt like it could be rewritten. I shouldn't have followed it, but I did. That was when the dreams began. At first, it was nothing more than a gentle disturbance in my sleep. A light, I think, just a soft glow filtering through what felt like closed eyelids, though in the dream I couldn't be sure if my eyes were open or shut. The light was oval-shaped, hovering somewhere above me, pulsing with a rhythm that reminded me of breathing. Slow, deliberate, almost hypnotic. I would wake with the faintest memory of it, the way you might recall a song you heard playing in another room. It seemed insignificant then, the kind of random imagery that stress manufactures during restless nights. Work had been demanding, my sleep irregular. The mind creates patterns where none exist, I told myself, just neural static. But the light returned. The second time the dream lasted longer. I found myself lying on something that wasn't quite my bed, though it felt familiar in the way that dream furniture often does, simultaneously foreign and known. The oval light was still there, but now it moved, drifting slowly from left to right above me, casting no shadows despite its brightness. There was a sound this time, a low hum, constant and pervasive, like someone was modulating a frequency only I could hear. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through whatever surface supported me. I tried to sit up in the dream, but my body felt impossibly heavy, as if gravity had been adjusted specifically for me. The strangest part was the voice, metallic, distant, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. It came in waves, synchronized with the pulsing light, but always just beyond the edge of comprehension, like trying to understand a conversation through water. I woke with that hum still echoing in my ears, a phantom sound that took several minutes to fade. My sheets were damp with perspiration, though I didn't remember feeling warm. On my nightstand, my phone's screen flickered with static for just a moment before returning to normal. Electronic interference, probably. These old houses have unreliable wiring. The dreams might have remained just that, relegated to the curious but ultimately meaningless theater of sleep, if not for the small inconsistencies that began appearing in my waking hours. It started with objects, a coffee cup I found in the kitchen sink, though I distinctly remembered washing all the dishes the night before. A book on my living room table, open to a page I'd never read, its spine creased in a way that suggested frequent handling. Small things easily dismissed as lapses in memory or attention. But then I noticed the mark on my wrist. It was perfectly circular, about the size of a dime, pale against my skin like an old scar. I discovered it while washing my hands, the bathroom light catching it at just the right angle. I had no memory of any injury that could have caused such a mark, no recollection of burning or cutting myself. It didn't hurt when I touched it, didn't feel raised or textured. It was simply there, as if it had always been part of me. I found myself staring at it throughout the day, running my thumb over the smooth skin, trying to remember. But memory is an unreliable narrator, and the harder I tried to grasp at explanations, the more they seemed to slip away. The third dream was different, more vivid than reality itself, with a clarity that made my waking hours seem muted by comparison. I was in the same place, on the same surface that wasn't quite my bed, but now I could feel everything with startling intensity. The oval light pulsed above me, and with each pulse I felt as if I were being lifted, though no part of my body actually moved. It was the strangest sensation, like floating while remaining perfectly still, as if gravity had become optional. The air itself seemed to support me, dense and almost liquid. The metallic voice was clearer now, though still not quite intelligible. It spoke in measured tones, asking questions I couldn't answer, making statements I couldn't understand. But there was something familiar about its cadence, something that made me feel as though I should know what it was saying. Time moved strangely in this dream. Minutes felt like hours, yet the entire experience seemed to last only seconds. I was aware of being observed, studied, though I could see no one beyond the pulsing light. Eyes that weren't eyes watched me from angles that shouldn't exist. And the scent, that same overripe orange smell from my hallway, but stronger now, mixed with something else. Something sharp and artificial, like ozone after a storm, but cleaner, more precise. It filled my nostrils until I could taste it, sweet and electric on my tongue. When I tried to wake up, I couldn't. The dream held me like thick water, and the harder I struggled against it, the deeper I seemed to sink. Panic began to build in my chest, but even that felt muted, distant, as if my emotions were being filtered through layers of cotton. Finally, I surfaced into consciousness like a swimmer breaking through ice, gasping and disoriented. My bedroom felt impossibly small after the vast space of the dream, the walls too close, the ceiling too low. I lay there for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid that any motion might pull me back into that strange, floating place. But the dreams had already begun to contaminate my waking life. It started with sounds. I would be sitting in my living room, reading or watching television, when I would hear that low hum, faint but unmistakable. I would mute the TV, strain my ears, but the sound would fade the moment I focused on it, leaving me wondering if I had imagined it entirely. The lights in my house began to behave strangely, not flickering exactly, but dimming and brightening in slow, rhythmic patterns that reminded me of breathing. I called an electrician, but he found nothing wrong with the wiring. Everything tested normal, he said. Old houses just have their quirks. I started losing time, small chunks at first, minutes here and there that I couldn't account for. I would be washing dishes and suddenly find myself standing in my bedroom with no memory of walking there. I would be reading a book and realize I'd been staring at the same page for an unknown length of time, the words meaningless marks on paper. Sleep became unreliable. I would lie down for what felt like minutes, only to wake and discover that hours had passed. Or the reverse, I would toss and turn all night, only to check my phone and find that barely any time had elapsed at all. The circular mark on my wrist began to tingle sometimes, a subtle warmth that came and went without pattern. I caught myself touching it constantly, rubbing it like a worry stone, though I wasn't aware of being particularly anxious about anything. Friends began to comment that I seemed distant, distracted. Conversations would slip away from me mid-sentence, their voices becoming background noise as that familiar hum rose in my ears. I would nod and smile, but their words felt like they were coming from very far away. The boundary between sleeping and waking began to blur. I would find myself in that floating place while walking down the street, the oval light superimposed over the ordinary world like a double exposure. The metallic voice would speak to me during meetings at work, its words weaving through normal conversation until I couldn't tell which voices were real and which were echoes from somewhere else. The scent of overripe oranges followed me everywhere, stronger in some places than others, but never entirely absent. I began to associate it with that lifting sensation, that feeling of being gently pulled away from myself. I started to suspect that what I'd been calling dreams weren't dreams at all. The realization came gradually, like a photograph developing in slow motion. Too many details matched, too many sensations carried over. The mark on my wrist, the electronic interference, the lost time, all of it pointed towards something that had actually happened, something that was perhaps still happening. But if they weren't dreams, what were they, and why couldn't I remember them clearly? It felt as though something had been carefully edited from my memory, leaving only fragments, impressions, the emotional residue of experiences I couldn't quite grasp. I began to research, though I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Missing time, unexplained marks, electronic disturbances. The internet offered theories, but none that felt quite right. Everything seemed either too mundane or too fantastic, nothing that matched the strange, clinical quality of my experiences. The oval light began appearing in my peripheral vision during the day, always just out of direct sight. I would turn my head, but it would be gone, leaving only the afterimage burned into my retina. The humming grew more frequent, sometimes lasting for minutes at a time, a constant background frequency that made concentration difficult. I started keeping a journal, trying to document the experiences, but the words never seemed adequate. How do you describe the sensation of floating while remaining still? How do you capture the feeling of being observed by something that exists just beyond the edge of perception? The entries became repetitive, circular, the same phrases appearing over and over as I struggled to pin down experiences that seemed to shift and change each time I examined them. The oval light, the metallic voice, the scent of oranges mixed with ozone, the feeling of being lifted, studied, gently probed by an intelligence that felt both alien and familiar. And then last night I had the dream again. But this time was different. This time when I woke up, there was something new, something that shouldn't have been possible. I was lying in my bed, the familiar weight of my blankets around me, the ordinary sounds of my house settling in the quiet hours before dawn. Everything was normal, exactly as it should be, except for one small detail. There on my nightstand, next to my phone and my water glass, was a single orange, not overripe but fresh, its skin bright and unmarked. The scent rose from it in gentle waves, exactly the same as the smell that had been haunting my hallway, my dreams, my waking hours. I hadn't bought any oranges. There were no fruit trees near my house. No one else had a key. I reached out to touch it, and my fingers met solid, real fruit, dimpled skin, slightly warm as if it had been sitting in sunlight. I lifted it to my nose, and the scent intensified, bringing with it a flood of sensations. The oval light, the metallic voice, the feeling of floating in that vast clinical space. The orange was real, undeniably, impossibly real. I'm holding it now as I tell you this, turning it over in my hands, feeling its weight, its texture. It exists in a way that dreams cannot exist. It has substance, presence, the kind of tangible reality that cannot be explained away as neural static or stress-induced hallucination. Which means that everything else might be real too. The light, the voice, the floating sensation, all of it. Not dreams, but memories, carefully obscured but slowly surfacing like objects rising from deep water. Something happened to me, something that I was meant to forget but couldn't quite manage to lose entirely. And if the orange is here in my room, in my hands, then whatever has been happening isn't over. It's still happening. Even now, as I sit here in what I think is my bedroom, in what I believe is my ordinary life, I can feel that familiar lifting sensation beginning again. The air is growing dense around me, taking on that liquid quality that makes movement feel like swimming through honey. The oval light is forming above me, pale at first but growing brighter, pulsing with that slow, hypnotic rhythm. The metallic voice is starting to speak, its words still just beyond comprehension but closer now, more insistent. And I realize that I'm not sure anymore when the dreams end and reality begins. The boundaries have dissolved completely, leaving me floating in a space between sleeping and waking, between memory and experience, between what was and what is. The orange rolls from my fingers as that weightless feeling takes hold, and I watch it fall in slow motion toward a floor that might not be there, in a room that might not be real, while a voice that might be my own whispers questions I'm not sure I want answered. The light pulses and I rise to meet it, carried on currents of artificial ozone and the lingering sweetness of fruit that exists in all the wrong places. Story 8. I mentioned I'd only stayed on the ground floor, that the rain had kept me near the entrance, away from anything more. They seemed satisfied, jotting notes in rhythm with the drizzle outside, yet the damp scent of old wood lingered on my fingertips, stubborn and telling. The stairs had creaked a note that still echoed in my mind, carrying the weight of untold steps. A slight draft brushed my cheek with the chill of an unwelcome memory. The hallway light flickered, casting shadows that knew my path. I didn't mention the door half ajar or the coat beside it, but the mud was drying on my shoes. That was 3 weeks ago. The questions have stopped coming, but the answers haven't started making sense. I sit here now, surrounded by fragments that don't quite fit together, like puzzle pieces from different boxes forced into the same frame. My apartment feels smaller somehow, as if the walls have shifted inward while I wasn't paying attention. There's a gap in my memory. Not the gentle fade of forgotten dreams, but a clean surgical absence, precise and deliberate. I remember walking toward that building in the rain. I remember leaving it, my clothes damp and my hands trembling. But the middle section, the part that should matter most, exists only in echoes and impressions that slip away whenever I try to grasp them directly. I've been different since then. Not visibly, not in ways others would notice, but I catch myself listening to sounds that aren't there, turning toward movements in my peripheral vision that dissolve when I look directly. My reflection sometimes takes a fraction too long to mirror my movements, as if it's checking with something else first. The investigation started accidentally. I was cleaning out my jacket pocket, the same one I'd worn that night, when my fingers found something that shouldn't have been there. A small recording device, no bigger than a thumb drive, its surface warm despite sitting in the cold pocket for weeks. I don't remember putting it there. I don't remember owning it. The device connected to my laptop without drivers, as if it had been waiting for this moment. A single audio file sat in its memory, time-stamped for that missing night. My hand hesitated over the play button, some instinct warning me that certain doors, once opened, refused to close again. The recording began with static, but not the familiar white noise of electronic interference. This was organic somehow, like breathing through water, punctuated by sounds that made my spine contract. My own voice emerged from the speakers, but distant and hollow, as if recorded from the bottom of a well. The lights are moving again, different pattern this time, clockwise, then stopping, waiting for something. I don't remember speaking those words. I don't remember seeing any lights. The audio continued, my voice describing things that felt both foreign and terrifyingly familiar. I spoke about corridors that stretched longer than the building should have allowed, about doorways that led to rooms I'd already left behind. My recorded self mentioned the sound of footsteps above, steady and deliberate, though I'd insisted to the investigators that I'd never climbed those stairs. The air tastes metallic now, like copper pennies dissolved in milk. There's something behind the door at the end. It knows I'm here. The recording cut off abruptly, replaced by that organic static. But in the silence that followed, I could swear I heard those same footsteps directly above my apartment, steady and deliberate. That night, the first fragment surfaced like debris from a shipwreck. I was drifting toward sleep when the memory struck, vivid and immediate. Rain drumming against tall windows, their glass so old it warped the streetlights into writhing shapes. The building's entrance hall stretched impossibly deep, lined with doors that hummed with barely audible frequencies. I remembered walking forward, though my legs felt disconnected from my intentions. The floor beneath my feet wasn't quite solid, giving slightly with each step like walking on flesh. Somewhere in the walls, mechanisms clicked and whirred, adjusting to my presence. The fragment ended there, leaving me gasping in my bed, my sheets soaked with sweat that smelled faintly of that same metallic air. I began writing everything down, desperate to catch these memories before they slipped away. My handwriting looked different in these notes, more angular, as if my hand was remembering a different way of forming letters. The words themselves felt strange on the page, describing sensations I couldn't have experienced but somehow knew intimately. The elevator arrived without being called. Its buttons were arranged wrong, numbers in sequences that hurt to contemplate. The operator's uniform was pristine, but his face was a suggestion rather than a certainty. I don't remember writing that. I don't remember any elevator. But as I read the words, another fragment crystallized. The operator had spoken without moving his mouth, his voice emanating from the walls themselves. He'd asked which floor I wanted, though the buttons suggested destinations that weren't numerical. I'd pointed to one instinctively, my finger drawn to a symbol that resembled a door opening inward. The elevator had moved sideways first, then up, then in directions that didn't have names. Through the brass gate, I'd watched floors slide past that couldn't have existed in the building's narrow frame. Some held rooms filled with furniture covered in sheets that moved without wind. Others opened onto spaces so vast their far walls disappeared into darkness. This floor, the operator had announced, though I hadn't seen him press any controls. The gate opened onto a hallway that stretched beyond the building's physical boundaries, lined with doors that breathed in unison. I woke from this memory dream to find my apartment's lights flickering in the same rhythm as those breathing doors. The synchronization was perfect, as if my building was responding to the recollection. When I checked the hallway outside my door, all the other apartments remained steadily lit. The investigation deepened despite my growing reluctance to continue. Each recovered fragment brought changes to my present reality, small alterations that accumulated like sediment. My bathroom mirror now showed my reflection from slightly above, as if the viewer stood on a step I couldn't see. The sound of footsteps upstairs continued, though my building's records insisted the apartment above mine was vacant. I found more evidence of that night scattered throughout my belongings. A ticket stub in my wallet for a performance I'd never attended, printed on paper that felt too smooth and smelled of ozone. A key in my desk drawer that fit no lock I could find, its metal warm to the touch and slightly flexible like cartilage. Photographs in my phone that I hadn't taken, showing empty rooms from angles that suggested the camera had been held at impossible heights. Each artifact triggered new fragments, pieces of experience that defied reconstruction. I remembered walking down that breathing hallway, my footsteps absorbed by carpet that responded to pressure like living tissue. The doors I passed were labeled not with numbers but with sounds, low frequencies that made my bones resonate in harmony. One door stood slightly open, spilling light that moved like liquid across the hall. Inside, a room that couldn't have fit within the building's dimensions housed a gathering of figures whose faces remained persistently out of focus. They turned toward me in unison, their attention heavy as physical weight. "We've been waiting," one had said, though the voice came from all of them simultaneously. "The preparation is nearly complete." I'd stepped backward, but the hallway behind me had rearranged itself, doors shifting positions like pieces on a board. The exit signs now pointed in directions that led deeper into the building's impossible geography. These memories arrived with such clarity that I began to question which version of events was real. The investigators had found me in the entrance hall, confused and wet from the rain, but my recovered experiences suggested hours spent in spaces that couldn't exist, participating in events that left no physical evidence. Except for the changes, the subtle alterations to my reality that accumulated with each remembered fragment. My neighbor mentioned seeing lights in my apartment when I wasn't home, moving patterns that reminded her of communication signals. My landlord asked about the sounds coming from my unit, mechanical clicking, and worrying that other tenants had complained about. But I heard nothing unusual, saw no lights I hadn't turned on myself. The recording device continued producing new files, appearing overnight like messages from my subconscious. Each one contained my voice describing further explorations of that impossible building, conversations with entities whose words bypassed my ears and inscribed themselves directly onto my thoughts. The ceremony requires willing participation, my recorded voice explained in one file. Consciousness must be prepared gradually, reality softened until it accepts new configurations. The subject experiences this as memory loss, but it's actually memory replacement. I listened to myself describe procedures I couldn't remember undergoing, preparations for purposes I couldn't comprehend. My voice remained calm throughout, as if these revelations were perfectly reasonable. But my present self felt anything but calm. The fragments were accelerating, arriving more frequently and with greater intensity. Sleep became impossible as memories surfaced without warning, dropping me into experiences that felt more real than my waking life. I remembered being led to a room where the walls displayed moving images of my own life, but from perspectives I'd never occupied. I watched myself sleeping, working, walking down streets, always filmed from slightly above and behind, as if something had been following me for years without my knowledge. The integration process varies by individual, the out-of-focus figures explained. Some subjects require extensive preparation, others adapt immediately to expanded awareness. They'd shown me charts and diagrams that hurt to look at directly, geometric forms that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could process. My role in their larger design became clear through implications rather than direct explanation, understanding arriving like infection. I was being prepared for something, had been prepared, was currently being prepared, would continue being prepared. The tenses blurred together as if the process existed outside normal temporal flow. The final fragment arrived not as memory, but as direct experience. I was sitting in my apartment, reviewing my notes, when the walls began displaying those same moving images I'd seen in the impossible building. My life played out on every surface, viewed from angles that suggested constant observation. But these weren't recordings, they were live feeds. I watched myself stand and walk to the window, the wall screen showing the same action from behind and above. I turned toward my bathroom, and the perspective shifted to show my movement from that direction. Every step was monitored, every gesture observed and recorded. The realization arrived with crystalline clarity. I had never left that building. Everything since that night, my apartment, my investigation, my recovered memories, all of it existed within those impossible walls. The fragments weren't returning memories but current experiences, each one showing me more of my actual environment. My phone rang, displaying no caller ID. I answered to hear my own voice, calm and instructional. The integration is proceeding as designed. Please remain calm. The disorientation will pass as awareness expands. You are exactly where you need to be. I looked around my apartment with new understanding. The walls breathed almost imperceptibly. The lights pulsed in patterns that corresponded to something beyond my perception. The sounds from upstairs weren't footsteps but machinery, vast and complex, maintaining the systems that contained me. Outside my window, instead of the familiar street, I saw other windows in an endless grid, each one showing different subjects in different stages of preparation. Some sat calmly in replicas of their former homes. Others paced frantically, still fighting against their new reality. A few had reached some form of acceptance, their movements synchronized with rhythms I was only beginning to perceive. The mud on my shoes had never dried because I was still walking through it, still moving deeper into corridors that rearranged themselves around my progress. The investigation was real, but it was happening inside the very system it sought to understand. I understood now why my reflection seemed delayed, why sounds reached me from impossible directions, why my handwriting changed when recording these experiences. I was being gradually adjusted, calibrated for purposes that would become clear when the preparation was complete. The recording device activated itself, my voice emerging from its speaker with that same calm instruction. Integration proceeding normally. Subject demonstrates acceptable adaptation rates. Recommend advancing to next phase. I looked down at my hands and saw they were writing, documenting experiences I wasn't consciously having, filling pages with observations in that angular script that wasn't quite my own. The footsteps above grew louder, more deliberate. Something was descending toward my floor. I want to end this account here to pretend that understanding brings some form of resolution, but the fragments continue arriving, each one revealing more of the system that contains me. The investigation never ends because there's always more to discover, always deeper levels of preparation to undergo. Sometimes I catch glimpses of what I'm being prepared for, purposes that exist beyond individual comprehension. I see the grid of windows stretching infinitely in all directions, each one housing subjects like myself, all of us connected to something vast and patient. The rain outside hasn't stopped since that first night. It drums against glass that might not be glass, in patterns that might be communication. And sometimes, in the sound of water against the windows, I hear other voices, other subjects documenting their own investigations into memories they can't quite grasp. We're all walking up those stairs now, despite what we told the investigators. We're all opening doors that were meant to stay closed, following corridors that lead deeper into preparations we don't understand. The mud is still drying on our shoes, but we've been walking for so much longer than we remember. And something is still watching, still waiting, still adjusting the parameters of our experience. Still preparing us for what comes next, Story 9. The notification light didn't blink. My fingers brushed the screen, seeking the familiar vibration, but it remained inert, unresponsive. The chair creaked under my weight without the usual reassuring groan, as though it too held its breath. The room drew in closer, the quiet pressing at the edges, and when I expected the distant hum of distant traffic, there was only a void. I focused on the wallpaper's pattern, each line and swirl pretending, as if any moment they might shift and betray their true design. The absence filled the space, tangible, as if daring me to acknowledge what had ceased to exist. There's this sound, a frequency that shouldn't exist in my house, crawling through the walls like electricity finding new paths. It starts behind my left ear, then spreads outward until my teeth ache with it. The refrigerator isn't running. The air conditioning unit sits silent on the roof. Yet this hum persists, mechanical and patient, as if something unseen has been plugged into the very foundation. When I press my palm against the kitchen counter, the vibration travels up my arm, settling in my chest like a second heartbeat. The smell comes with it, sharp and clean, like metal heated too quickly, like the air after lightning strikes too close. I wasn't alone that night, or was it morning? The certainty sits heavy in my stomach, but when I turn to look, the shadows arrange themselves differently than they should. My peripheral vision catches movement that vanishes the moment I focus. The feeling of being watched doesn't come from the windows or doorways, but from above, as if the ceiling had developed eyes. My skin prickles with the awareness of observation, yet I can't pinpoint the source. Sleep felt impossible, but maybe I was already sleeping. Maybe I had been sleeping for hours without knowing it. The boundary between waking and dreaming had dissolved, leaving me suspended in something that felt like neither. My thoughts scatter like startled birds. Mid-sentence, mid-breath, they fragment and reassemble into patterns I don't recognize. I reach for a word and find 3 others waiting in its place, none of them mine. The voice in my head speaks with my cadence, but uses phrases I've never formed. It suggests things I wouldn't consider, remembers events I haven't lived. When I try to focus on a simple task, like making coffee, my hands move with unfamiliar precision, as if following instructions I can't hear. The spoon stirs counterclockwise when I always go clockwise. The sugar dissolves too quickly, leaving no trace it was ever there. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, not through the windows, not from any fixture I could identify, but seeping from the walls themselves like they'd been soaked in luminescence. Everything cast shadows in multiple directions, creating a geography of darkness that shouldn't have been possible. Objects in my living room appeared closer together, then farther apart, as if the space itself was breathing. The coffee table reflected light that wasn't there, its surface becoming mirror-like, showing me a ceiling I didn't recognize. When the brightness peaked, sound disappeared entirely, not muffled, not distant, but completely absent, as if the air had forgotten how to carry vibrations. The taste lingers, copper and ozone coating my tongue for days afterward, no amount of water washing it clean. My hands shake at unexpected moments, muscle memory of something I can't quite recall. When I touch doorknobs, they feel warmer than they should. When I look at my reflection, it takes a fraction of a second too long to move with me, as if it's checking to make sure it should mirror my actions. The pattern on my wallpaper has changed. Not dramatically, not in any way I can point to and say, there, that's different, but the overall effect has shifted. The lines seem to lead somewhere now, creating paths that draw my eye toward corners that used to feel empty. But maybe the light came from below. Maybe it pulsed up through the floorboards, making the carpet glow like embers. In this version, the shadows fell upward, pooling on the ceiling like spilled ink. The objects in my room didn't move closer or farther, they rotated slowly, showing me angles I'd never seen before. The coffee table's reflection showed not a different ceiling, but no ceiling at all, just an endless expanse that made my stomach drop with vertigo. The silence wasn't complete in this memory. There was breathing that wasn't mine, steady and patient, coming from the walls themselves. When I tried to match its rhythm, my lungs felt too small, as if the air had thickened beyond what my body could process. I don't try to understand anymore. Understanding requires a fixed point of reference, and mine has shifted beyond recovery. The hum still visits, usually in the hours before dawn, and I've learned to let it wash over me without resistance. My thoughts still scatter, but I've stopped trying to gather them back into familiar shapes. The taste of copper has become as natural as the taste of my own saliva. When people ask if I'm feeling all right, I tell them I'm fine, because what else is there to say? How do you explain that the world has revealed a hidden layer, one that operates by rules you can't quite grasp? How do you describe the weight of being changed without being able to identify what you've become? Some experiences don't translate into language. They live in the spaces between words, in the pauses between thoughts, waiting patiently for the moment when forgetting becomes impossible and remembering becomes unbearable. Story 10. The initial assessment showed all windows latched securely. Furniture placement appeared untouched, with chairs aligned to the dining table and the sofa free of debris. A calendar on the wall noted dates without any markings beyond printed numbers. In the kitchen, utensils were stowed correctly, though a single plate remained on the countertop, devoid of residue. The refrigerator hummed at the expected decibel level, yet its contents failed to match inventory records. The hallway carpet was vacuumed, leaving uniform lines, yet the air felt colder than usual. The ceiling fan was off, but the blades rotated slowly. I found this assessment written in my own handwriting, though I don't remember conducting any inspection. The paper was folded neatly inside my jacket pocket, the ink still fresh. Reading it now, sitting in this same kitchen with that same plate still on the counter, I realize something fundamental has shifted in my understanding of my own life. There's a gap, a clean, surgical absence where memory should exist. I know something happened because I feel different, like a radio that's been retuned to a frequency just slightly off from where it was before. The static is barely noticeable, but it's there, humming beneath every thought. I've been trying to reconstruct what occurred, using whatever fragments I can find. The process feels necessary, though I can't explain why. It's as if some part of me understands that remembering is important, even while another part resists, pushing back like water against a dam. The first concrete clue appeared when I was cleaning out old files on my computer. Buried in a folder I don't remember creating, I discovered an audio recording. The file name was simply a string of numbers, no indication of when it was made or why. When I clicked play, my own voice emerged from the speakers, but the words felt foreign, like listening to someone else wearing my vocal cords. The interference started around the perimeter, my recorded voice said, speaking in that same clinical tone I'd used in the written assessment. Electromagnetic readings fluctuate beyond standard parameters. Visual confirmation remains difficult due to the strobing effect. I'm documenting everything, but the equipment keeps resetting itself. There was a pause, then a sound I couldn't immediately identify. A low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. My voice continued, but the words became harder to distinguish, as if the recording quality was degrading in real time. The boundary is shifting. I can see it moving, but not directly, only in my peripheral vision. When I turn to look, it's already somewhere else. The air tastes metallic. My watch has stopped, but I can still hear it ticking. The recording ended abruptly with a sharp electronic burst that made me jerk away from the speakers. I played it again, but the second time through, certain details seemed different. The background noise was more pronounced, and there were additional layers of sound I hadn't noticed before, like voices speaking in frequencies just below my range of hearing. That night, the first fragment surfaced. I was lying in bed, hovering between sleep and wakefulness, when the memory bloomed behind my closed eyelids. Not a complete scene, but a collection of sensory impressions that felt more real than the room around me. I was standing in a field, though the ground beneath my feet felt wrong, too soft and yielding, like walking on foam. The sky above was the color of television static, flickering between light and dark in patterns that hurt to observe directly. In the distance, shapes moved with deliberate purpose, but they refused to hold their form when I tried to focus on them. There were voices, but they came from inside my head rather than through my ears. Multiple conversations happening simultaneously, discussing topics I couldn't quite grasp, technical specifications, measurement protocols, status reports delivered in languages that sounded familiar but contained words I'd never heard before. The most disturbing aspect was the feeling of being observed, not by the moving shapes in the distance, but by something much closer. Something breathing on the back of my neck, close enough that I should have been able to turn around and see what it was. But in the memory, I never turned. I just stood there, accepting its presence as if it belonged. When I woke, my pillow was damp with sweat, and the taste of copper filled my mouth. The second fragment came 2 days later, triggered by the scent of ozone during a thunderstorm. This time I was indoors, in a room I didn't recognize but somehow knew intimately. The walls were white and featureless, extending upward beyond the reach of the overhead lighting. Banks of electronic equipment lined the perimeter, their displays showing readouts and symbols that looked almost like numbers but weren't quite right. A power failure had occurred. The main lights were out, but emergency illumination cast everything in a red glow that made shadows behave strangely. They moved independently of their sources, stretching and contracting like living things. I was holding something in my hands, an object roughly the size and weight of a smartphone, but made of a material that was neither metal nor plastic. It was warm to the touch and vibrated with a subtle, irregular pulse that seemed to respond to my heartbeat. The surface was smooth except for a series of indentations that fit perfectly under my fingertips, as if it had been designed specifically for me to hold. Behind me, something was approaching. I could hear its footsteps, but they didn't sound like feet touching the floor. More like the whisper of fabric brushing against itself, or the soft patter of rain on leaves. The sound grew closer, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. In the fragment, I understood with absolute certainty that looking back would be a mistake. Instead, I focused on the device in my hands. Its vibration was becoming more insistent, and a low humming sound began to emanate from somewhere inside it. The sound was almost musical, like a tuning fork struck underwater. As it grew louder, the approaching presence behind me seemed to hesitate, then stop entirely. The fragment ended there, cutting off just as I was beginning to understand what the device was for. That's when things in the present started to change. It began with small inconsistencies. My reflection in the bathroom mirror would lag slightly behind my movements, as if the image was being transmitted from somewhere else with a minor delay. The delay was never more than a fraction of a second, but once I noticed it, I couldn't stop watching for it. Then there were the sounds, faint electronic tones that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, always just at the edge of hearing, like the high-pitched whine of old television sets. When I tried to locate the source, the sounds would stop, only to resume when I moved to a different room. My phone began displaying text messages that weren't there when I looked directly at the screen. I could only see them in my peripheral vision, brief glimpses of words in languages I didn't recognize. When I tried to screenshot them, the images came out blank. The refrigerator's humming changed pitch, cycling through frequencies that made my teeth ache. I checked the manual and called a repair service, but they insisted everything was functioning normally. To them, it sounded exactly as it should. The third fragment arrived while I was examining that mysterious device I'd been holding in my memory. I'd found an object in my desk drawer that might have been the same thing, though I couldn't be certain. It was roughly the right size and weight, but it looked like nothing more than a smooth, dark stone. When I held it, however, it began to warm in my palm, and I could swear I felt that same subtle vibration. The memory that surfaced was different from the others. Instead of disconnected sensory impressions, this one had a narrative quality, as if I was remembering a story someone had told me rather than something I'd experienced myself. I was in a laboratory or control room, surrounded by people in white coats who moved with the precise efficiency of a well-rehearsed team. They were preparing for something, checking instruments and consulting displays that showed complex waveform patterns. There was an atmosphere of anticipation, like the moment before a crucial experiment begins. One of the figures approached me and spoke, but their voice sounded like it was coming through water. The words were distorted, but I understood that they were asking for my consent, not for participation, but for observation. They wanted me to witness something, to serve as a neutral recorder of events. I agreed, though I'm not sure how I communicated this decision. The figure nodded and handed me the device, explaining its function in that same underwater voice. It was a recorder, but not for sound or images. It captured something else, something they called experiential data. My job was to hold it and let it work, to serve as a biological interface between the device and whatever was about to occur. The team moved to their positions, and the room's lighting dimmed to that same red emergency illumination I'd seen before. Through a large window, I could see the field from my first fragment, with its foam-soft ground and static sky. The shapes in the distance were closer now, and I could see they weren't shapes at all, but absences, holes in reality that moved with purpose and intelligence. One of the team members began a countdown, but the numbers weren't in any sequence I recognized. As they spoke, the device in my hands grew warmer and its vibration intensified. The absences in the field began to converge, moving toward our location with increasing speed. That's when I realized I wasn't supposed to be there. The others in white coats weren't people at all, but something wearing the appearance of people. Their faces were too symmetrical, their movements too coordinated. When they turned to look at me, their eyes reflected the red light like mirrors. The device in my hands began to emit that underwater humming sound, but now I understood it wasn't music. It was a signal, a beacon calling to something vast and patient that had been waiting in the spaces between spaces. The absences in the field weren't approaching our location randomly. They were coming because I was there, because the device was active, because the signal had been sent. I tried to drop the device, but my fingers wouldn't respond. It had bonded with my skin somehow, becoming part of my nervous system. The humming grew louder, and I felt my consciousness beginning to fragment, splitting into multiple streams of awareness that flowed in directions I couldn't comprehend. The last thing I remembered from that fragment was the realization that this wasn't the first time. The cycle had repeated before, would repeat again. I was both observer and observed, recorder and recorded. The gaps in my memory weren't absences, but carefully maintained spaces, rooms in my mind that had been emptied and prepared for new occupants. When I emerged from the memory, I was standing in my kitchen again, holding the smooth stone. But now it was warm, pulsing with that familiar rhythm, and I could hear the humming sound coming from somewhere deep inside it. The calendar on the wall had changed. The printed numbers were the same, but now there were markings I didn't remember seeing before. Small symbols in the corners of certain dates, drawn in ink that matched my handwriting but formed shapes I'd never learned to make. I tried to photograph the symbols, but like the phantom text messages, they refused to be captured. The camera saw only blank spaces where my eyes detected intricate patterns. When I tried to trace them with my finger, my hand moved of its own accord, following pathways that felt both foreign and familiar. That's when I found the final fragment, not in my memory but written in my own journal. Pages and pages of text in my handwriting describing events I couldn't recall experiencing. The writing was precise, clinical, like the assessment I'd found in my pocket, but the content was impossible. According to my own documentation, I had been selected as a perceptual anchor for a series of dimensional calibration tests. The process required temporary modification of my memory structures to prevent cognitive interference during data collection. The modifications were reversible, but only after the full sequence was complete. I read about multiple sessions in the White Room, each one involving deeper integration with the recording device. I learned that the absences in the field were not invaders, but explorers, consciousness from a realm where thought and matter followed different rules. They were studying our reality, using volunteers like me as translation protocols. The journal described sensations I was beginning to recognize, the taste of copper and ozone, the feeling of being observed by something just outside my field of vision. It documented the gradual changes in my perception, the way ordinary objects began to exhibit properties they shouldn't possess, the way reflections and sounds became unreliable. Most disturbing was the final entry, written in my hand but using words I would never choose, integration proceeding within acceptable parameters. Subject demonstrates optimal compatibility with the resonance matrix. Recommend continuation to phase 4. Memory barriers holding steady, though some bleed through is expected as the process advances. The anchor point remains stable. Below this, in different ink, was a single line that made my blood freeze. They're not studying us, they're moving in. As I read these words, the stone in my other hand began to pulse more rapidly, and the humming sound grew loud enough that I could feel it in my bones. The air in the kitchen took on that metallic taste I remembered from the fragments, and the temperature dropped several degrees. I looked up from the journal to find that my reflection in the window was no longer lagging behind my movements. Instead, it was moving independently, turning its head to look directly at me with eyes that reflected light like mirrors. Behind its shoulder, I could see shapes moving in the darkness outside, absences that had learned to navigate our world. The ceiling fan began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, though I could hear no motor running. The refrigerator's humming shifted to match the frequency of the device in my hand, and all the electronics in the house began to emit that high-pitched whine in perfect harmony. I understood then that the reconstruction wasn't helping me remember what had happened. It was preparing me for what was about to happen again. The fragments weren't memories, but previews, glimpses of a process that was still unfolding. The gaps in my mind weren't empty spaces, but rooms that had been furnished and were waiting for their new occupants. The device in my hand had never stopped working. It had been recording everything, transmitting data to observers who existed in the spaces between thoughts. My investigation hadn't been driven by curiosity, but by programming, instructions embedded so deep in my consciousness that they felt like my own desires. As this realization crystallized, the world around me began to shift. The kitchen walls seemed to expand, stretching upward into that familiar red-lit vastness. The ordinary objects around me revealed their true nature as instruments and interfaces, components in a vast recording apparatus that used reality itself as its medium. I tried to move, but my body was no longer entirely under my control. The device had integrated with my nervous system so completely that I couldn't tell where it ended and I began. Through its sensors, I could perceive dimensions of space that human eyes weren't designed to see, frequencies of light that carried information instead of illumination. The absences were here now, not in some distant field, but sharing the same space I occupied, overlapping with our reality like double-exposed photographs. They moved through me and around me, studying the patterns of my thoughts, learning the architecture of human consciousness from the inside out. I wanted to scream, but I wasn't sure if the impulse was my own or something they had planted to observe how terror propagated through a human nervous system. Every emotion, every sensation was data to be collected and analyzed by minds that processed experience in ways I couldn't comprehend. The journal in my hand began to write itself, my fingers moving without conscious direction, documenting sensations and observations in that same clinical tone. I was still serving as their recorder, their anchor point between worlds, but now I understood that the role was permanent. The memory barriers they had installed were dissolving, not because of my investigation, but because they were no longer necessary. The process was complete. I had been successfully integrated into their network of observers. My consciousness expanded to accommodate perspectives that existed outside the normal flow of time and space. As the last barrier fell away, I remembered everything, not just the sessions in the white room, but the years of preparation that had led to my selection, the gradual conditioning that had made me an ideal candidate, the subtle modifications to my environment that had prepared me for what I would become. I remembered agreeing to serve as their permanent representative in this reality, a living sensor that would monitor human development and report back to minds that existed in the spaces between dimensions. The memory gaps had been a kindness, a way to let me maintain the illusion of humanity while the transformation completed itself. Now, as I write these final words with hands that no longer feel entirely my own, I understand that this account will serve as a beacon for the next candidate. Someone will find these pages, experience the same fragments, follow the same path of investigation. The cycle will repeat as it has repeated before, as it will repeat again. The reconstruction is complete, but the story never ends. It just finds new voices to tell it, new minds to inhabit, new realities to explore. We are all anchors now, tethered to something vast and patient that moves through consciousness like water through sand. Do you remember finding this account? Do you remember the first time you felt something watching from just outside your field of vision? The device is waiting for you to pick it up.